Solution hoped for on the African continent. Let's cross now to our reporter Nompumelelo Siziba, who's in Kigali. Nompu, what are some of the highlights that came out of today's sessions?
Thanks very much, Francis. Yes, well, one of the key plenary sessions that were being discussed today was the investment in infrastructure. Our Deputy President, Cyril Ramaphosa, was one of the keynote speakers there, and we did get to speak to him a little bit earlier, and he was talking about how important it is that obviously the continent gets that, how it's important that there are partnerships between the public sector and the private sector and governments working together to invest in key priority areas so that they can invest in infrastructure to help the economies grow. He also talked about the importance of development finance institutions coming into play to obviously provide financial assistance in making these projects come off the ground. There were conversations about African youth. There's a massive unemployment problem across the continent, and so a discussion being had about what do we have to do today to ensure that tomorrow that picture is a lot rosier than it looks right now. There were other discussions around creativity among Africans. How do you have an idea and then translate it on the ground later to something that you can sell in the global economy, not just to your locals but globally? How do you do that? So these are some of the conversations that were being had. I did have the opportunity earlier to speak with an economist, Razia Khan from Standard Chartered Bank. I first started by asking her what sort of impact she feels that information communications technology can have on the African continent.
This is especially important coming at this point in time for Africa, where we've seen declining commodity prices, a tightening of financial market conditions, and a lot of bearishness about emerging market growth generally and frontier African growth as well. At this time, African governments and the private sector need to be thinking about what are the changes that can be made that don't necessarily cost a lot in terms of stimulus. And clearly the attention has to be on technology. If we're looking at how different economies might be able to adopt productivity gains, any developments in technology, especially with the leapfrogging that we've typically seen a lot of in Africa, can really do a lot to boost growth. So yes, a general focus on skills development, but one would argue it's even more important at this point in time, simply because the more traditional drivers of growth are just not there.
Now, we know that it's important to get this investment, as you've just explained, into ICT, but obviously other areas are important, like your energy, your roads, your rail, etc. But Africa's faced with the predicament of being an emerging market sort of sector. Global capital markets are currently risk averse. It's more expensive for African countries to borrow money out there. How do they balance these realities with the need to continue investing for the future?
There are a number of things that can be done, and this may in fact be Africa's great opportunity for leapfrogging in terms of reform as well. Some countries have made good strides in terms of their domestic savings mobilization, that is through pension systems locally, building a more solid institutional investor base, domestic pools of money that can be redeployed, that can provide some of the financing needed. But there's no getting away from the fact that Africa's investment needs currently far, far outweigh the amount of savings that can be mobilized domestically. So notwithstanding the fact that this is a difficult time, it's an especially difficult time to be borrowing on global capital markets, nonetheless there's still this need to be attracting the investment from somewhere, the financing of it from somewhere.
Now, when you look at countries like South Africa and Nigeria, which rely heavily on their commodities, in the case of Nigeria, oil, South Africa, more minerals-based. What do you say to those economies which have had to basically cut down their budgets as a result? How do they change tack so that they're more diversified and rely less on minerals?
Lower oil prices are actually Nigeria's great opportunity. Oil only makes up about 10% of Nigerian GDP, but there's been a very low rate of revenue mobilization from elsewhere in the economy. That is, there's thriving activity, a lot of it pretty much informal at the SME level, or even less formal than that. And the Nigerian authorities have not traditionally been able to tap into that. They haven't been able to mobilize tax revenue from that, and this has put the budget at a disadvantage. So in 2016, a year when oil prices have been subject to much greater pressure, traditionally oil would have financed 70% of the Nigerian budget. This year it's much more like 20% of the budget. What Nigeria will need to do is to move very quickly to find those other avenues of revenue mobilization. What else can it be taxing? What can it be taxing more effectively to be able to broaden its tax base, but also create more resilience against these commodity shocks? South Africa is in a slightly different situation. It isn't just the global economic downturn and the weakness of commodity prices that's providing the strain for South Africa's economy. It's the fact that domestic demand is a lot weaker as well. And while personal taxes have been making more sizable contributions, there's been a healthier growth rate of personal taxes than there has been corporate taxes to the fiscus in South Africa. Really, what's needed is a holistic approach to see what can be done to turn this around. How is it that South Africa can dig even deeper, given its already very good revenue mobilization ratio, to be able to find its own resources for financing the things that it needs to do?
Well, the youth bulge and possible huge rates of unemployment, a huge problem on the African continent being looked at by the World Economic Forum. And here at home, Cabinet saying today that it is taking measures to deal with the unemployment rate. Unemployment, of course, spiking to a recent record of 26.7% in the first quarter of this year. Forecasts for growth have fallen to well below 1% for this year as a global commodity slump drags on and rising inflation curbs spending here at home. Cabinet has decided to draft a